In a house built from marble and silence, a duke stands haunted by duty, caught between mourning and the demand for an heir. Across the hallways, unseen by eyes that judge and whisper, a maid holds a secret etched in pencil, a portrait that could unravel his carefully guarded heart. Two worlds, forbidden to touch, balanced at the edge of scandal. But in the quiet shadows of Ashbourne Hall, truth waits patiently, and it will soon shatter everything they know about love and loyalty. Welcome to a romance of hidden longing and impossible choices. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? And what captivates you most about period romances? The first light of morning touched the frost-kissed windows of Ashbourne Hall, casting a faint silver hue upon the marble floors that lined the east corridor. A hush hovered over the great estate, not from stillness, but from the breath held in anticipation. Within the quiet grandeur of its stone walls, something had begun to stir, not in the parlours where the clocks ticked with aristocratic precision, nor in the drawing rooms prepared for laughter yet to come, but in the spaces between, in the corners where servants moved like shadows, swift and unseen. At the heart of this anticipation was duty. Duty cloaked in velvet and lace, in polished shoes and perfumed letters. For the 11th Duke of Ashbourne, Sebastian Edward Harland, had at last yielded to pressure. After 2 years of mourning, Parliament had grown impatient. The lineage required preservation, the crown demanded an heir, and so the invitations had been dispatched, gilded and sealed, to the most desirable young ladies of England's high society. They would arrive within days, fluttering into the hall like jeweled moths drawn to the flame of a noble title and a haunted widower's gaze. Mrs. Templeton, the head housekeeper, stood at the center of the servants' hall like a general before battle. Her voice, calm but commanding, echoed through the passageways as she assigned duties with brisk efficiency. "Eliza, you'll be reassigned to the East Wing. You'll assist with the preparation of Lady Strathmore's chamber, and mind the mirrors. Her ladyship's vanity is not a myth." Eliza Green gave a small nod, curtsied, and quietly withdrew. She did not speak unless necessary. She did not draw attention. For nearly 10 years, she had lived within the house, beneath its chandeliers and behind its silken curtains, moving with the grace of someone who understood the value of silence. Her hazel eyes, flecked with gold, saw everything. Her hands, though calloused, were deft, and in the pocket of her apron, tucked deep within her modest cotton skirt, she kept a folded piece of parchment, a sketch, one of many. It was not vanity, but survival. Drawing gave shape to the emotions she could never voice aloud. That morning, as she dusted the frame of a portrait in the long gallery, Eliza paused. A figure stood across the far threshold, half-veiled by the pale light spilling through the tall windows. The Duke. Sebastian Ashbourne rarely descended so early. He was dressed in a dark morning coat, his hair impeccably combed back, though silver now streaked its temples. His eyes, grey-blue, somber as the English sky, swept the corridor, not seeking, merely existing. Eliza lowered her gaze immediately, but something in the stillness held her there a moment too long. Not a word passed between them, not even a glance she could be sure of, and yet she felt it. The presence of a man weighed down by ghosts, a man who once loved so fiercely that grief had become his second skin. He walked on. She exhaled. In the servants' quarters, the younger maids giggled behind hands, speaking of silks and titles, of the possibility, however absurd, that one might catch the Duke's eye. Eliza never joined their games. She had no illusions, not about dukes, and certainly not about herself. Her world was measured in linens and hours, in the quiet creak of staircases climbed before dawn, in the comfort of a solitary sketch done by candlelight. She preferred it that way. And yet, later, as snow began to fall in soft spirals upon the stone balustrades, Eliza crossed the south garden, carrying warmed sheets for the guest wing. The world was silent, save for the hush of winter descending. She paused near the edge of the rose walk, where the frost had claimed the last of the blooms, now withered and folded into themselves. Across the garden, the Duke stood again. This time he did not move. He looked out into the pale expanse, unmoving, as though listening to something only he could hear. Unseen, Eliza watched. Her breath clouded in the air. A longing she could not name stirred within her, fragile, foolish, and forbidden. But it came all the same, born not of dreams, but of recognition. She had drawn him once, in the stillness of the library, not in his coat of arms or noble form, but as he was then, sorrowful, silent, and achingly human. And though she would never speak of it, though she would carry the sketch like a secret stitched into her apron, she had seen the man behind the title, and that was enough, for now. The library of Ashbourne Hall was unlike any other room in the estate. It was not the grandest, nor the most decorated. There were no gilded ceilings, no brocade draperies, no ostentatious mirrors catching sunlight like golden serpents. And yet it held something no ballroom could boast: memory. Lined from floor to ceiling in dark walnut shelves, its air carried the scent of ink, vellum, and dust. Old dust, the kind that settled not from neglect, but from reverence. Thick velvet curtains, drawn back only part way, let in the reluctant winter light. A fire crackled in the hearth, but the warmth it offered was quiet, unobtrusive, almost shy. It was here that Eliza Green found herself assigned on that cold January morning, with her cleaning cloths, her pail of oil soap, and a heart she tried to keep still. She had always loved the library. It was a sacred space, one where words and silence coexisted without conflict. When the other maids whispered of the ballroom or the solarium, Eliza dreamed of the library's soft hush and steady companionship. It was, for her, the only place in the house where she didn't feel entirely out of place. She moved carefully between the tall shelves, her fingers brushing along the spines with the gentleness of one who respects what cannot speak back. Volumes of Latin sermons, faded journals, histories of distant empires, and letters bound in satin ribbons rested side by side like old soldiers, wounded, dignified, eternal. On this particular morning, the snow fell again. It sifted like flour over the great bay windows, blurring the outside world. Eliza had drawn the curtains only halfway, letting the soft grey light bathe the room in a solemn glow. The house was quiet. Even the staff seemed hushed, as though the snow had muffled their voices. She had just reached the old armchair by the hearth, the one no one ever sat in now when it happened. Her apron caught on the corner of the chair's carved leg, and in a graceless motion, the sketchbook hidden deep in her pocket tumbled to the floor. It landed with a gentle thud, paper fanning open. Eliza froze. The book lay open, shamefully exposed, revealing the face she had traced more than once. A face not of royalty nor perfection, but of weariness, grief, and loneliness. The Duke, drawn from memory, from silent observation, and, though she would never admit it, from longing. She bent down swiftly to retrieve it, but before her hand could touch the page, a voice pierced the quiet. "You drew this?" Sebastian Ashbourne stood at the threshold. She did not know how long he had been there. Perhaps he had entered in silence, as he often did, without fanfare or escort. He wore no hat, and his dark frock coat bore the faintest trace of melted snow on the shoulders. His gloves were in his left hand, and his right hovered just above the fallen book, as though reluctant to touch it. Eliza's breath caught. Her voice faltered. "Forgive me, Your Grace." He looked down again at the page. The sketch was neither flattering nor cruel. It simply was. His eyes, drawn in soft pencil, were shadowed beneath, and his mouth, unsmiling, bore the weight of unspoken things. It was not a duke she had captured. It was a man. He bent slowly and picked up the book, closing it with care before offering it to her. "You see me," he said, his voice low, unreadable, "as I truly am." Eliza dared not meet his gaze. "I meant no disrespect, sir." He studied her. There was no rebuke in his face, only something quieter, like astonishment caught off guard. "You have talent," he said at last. She gave a slight nod, eyes fixed on the floor. Her hands trembled as she took back the sketchbook. For a long moment, he said nothing more. The fire crackled softly between them. "Do you often draw the people who live here?" he asked, not unkindly. "Sometimes," she whispered, "only in private." He looked toward the armchair, then the shelves, as though seeing them differently now. His brow furrowed faintly. "I've walked this room 100 times, he murmured, more to himself than to her. "And yet, I never saw it through someone else's eyes." Eliza said nothing. She felt exposed in a way that words could not repair. At length he stepped back. "Thank you," he said, simply, sincerely. Then he turned and walked away. She stood motionless for what felt like hours. That night, the candles in the upper hallways flickered with unrest. The great double doors of Ashbourne Hall opened once more, and winter blew in not snow, but silk and perfume. Lady Anne Strathmore arrived precisely as expected, draped in French blue satin, with her golden curls arranged in flawless ringlets and her chin lifted in calculated elegance. Her carriage was emblazoned with her family crest, and her maid trailed behind her like a shadow trained in servitude. The household stirred. Maids carried up boxes of lace and feathers. Footmen steadied trunks full of imported gloves and veils. In the drawing room, the scent of rose oil announced her presence before her voice ever did. She did not speak often, but when she did, her words had the weight of cold steel wrapped in velvet. Mrs. Templeton received her personally, offering the requisite greetings and polite reverence. But behind her cordial expression, something shifted. Her eyes flicked to Eliza, who lingered near the staircase, and for the first time in many months, the housekeeper looked at her, not with simple tolerance, but with curiosity. It was not that Eliza had spoken out of turn. It was not that she had misstepped. It was that something about her had changed. Perhaps it was the way she avoided looking toward the Duke during supper service, or the new stillness in her hands when she arranged the candlesticks, or the way her sketchbook, though hidden, now felt heavier in her apron pocket. Mrs. Templeton had seen many girls come and go, some foolish, some clever, most harmless. But Eliza Green had always been an enigma. No family letters, no past spoken of, no dreams voiced aloud, just service, silence, and the rare, fleeting light of a smile that she wore like a secret. Now, with Lady Anne poised to dazzle the hall, with her gowns and her name and her practiced grace, something began to stir beneath the surface. And Mrs. Templeton, who had served 3 generations of Ashbournes, knew one thing better than most. When silence begins to shift, it means the storm is not far behind. The great doors of Ashbourne Hall did not rest. One after another, the carriages arrived, polished to gleaming, crested with ancient coats of arms, pulled by restless stallions whose breath smoked in the winter air. The sound of wheels on gravel echoed like a procession of intentions, each arrival a declaration. This house, this man, this title was a prize worth claiming. By the end of the second week of January, the hall had transformed into a theatre of grandeur. Every room was dressed in expectation. Fireplaces were kept roaring, their flames licking high and golden in rooms that had long known only silence. The ballroom's floor was polished daily until it reflected every chandelier like a frozen lake. Silver was buffed, china laid, and music rehearsed. Violins that once wept for lost hours now played for futures yet to be arranged. They came dressed in silks the color of sugared violets, in velvets embroidered with pearls and promise. The daughters of viscounts, marquises, and barons, each carrying the burden of their lineage on fragile shoulders, floated through the corridors like swans with sharpened eyes. Their laughter was soft and calculated, their compliments rehearsed to precision, their glances toward the Duke timed like clockwork. Sebastian Ashbourne, for his part, performed as expected. He greeted each guest with faultless courtesy. At dinners, he raised his glass when tradition required. At musicales, He listened attentively to pianoforte sonatas and arias sung with trembling hope. He even rode out with a few of the ladies, offering an arm to mount or descend, always with propriety. But his smile, though present, did not touch the depths of his eyes. It was a mask of silk stretched over stone. Only Charles Hawthorne, the steward who had served the Ashbournes for nearly 20 years, noticed the shadows gathering beneath the Duke's stillness. He observed them with the quiet precision of a man who knew when a storm was near, even if the sky was clear. On the third Sunday after Epiphany, Charles approached his master in the study, a room rarely used of late, filled with ledgers, unopened correspondence, and a decanter of untouched brandy. "The young ladies are eager to impress," Charles said gently, his spectacles resting low on the bridge of his nose. "And Parliament watches from a distance." Sebastian, seated at the desk, did not look up. "Let them watch," he muttered. "They will see what they have always seen. A man dressed in grief, pretending at life." Charles hesitated. "Forgive me, Your Grace, but grief loses its sympathy when it begins to interfere with succession." The words, spoken without malice, hung in the room like smoke. Sebastian rose from his chair and walked to the window. Outside, a pair of young ladies practiced archery on the lawn, their delicate fingers wrapped in satin gloves, their laughter carrying faintly on the cold breeze. "I am not a stallion to be bred," he said quietly, "and I will not barter what remains of my soul to fulfill a contract of bloodlines." Charles said nothing more, but the weight of duty lingered between them. Elsewhere in the hall, in corridors far removed from silk and sonatas, Eliza Green moved like a current beneath still waters. She kept to her tasks, unassuming and invisible, yet the whispers followed her like breath upon glass. The other maids had begun to murmur in corners, nothing overt, nothing cruel, but laced with curiosity. Her name floated now and then between phrases like "too quiet," "always watching," and "did you see how the Duke looked at her just once near the stairs?" Eliza heard, but did not react. She had long since learned the art of silence, not merely in voice, but in breath, in footstep, in presence. It was her armor, her refuge, and yet even armor cracks. Late one afternoon, she was sent to dust the small chapel nestled near the west wing. It was rarely used, but its wood was kept polished and its silver chalices gleaming. As she reached for a hymnal high on a shelf, her hand brushed against something unexpected. A folded piece of paper, thin with age, slipped and landed at her feet. She knelt and picked it up. It was a letter, creased, worn, its edges softened by time. Her breath caught in her throat as she recognized the handwriting, her mother's. Eliza sat on the worn pew beneath the stained glass window and opened the letter with trembling fingers. "My dearest Eliza," it began, "if you ever find this, know that I loved you as fiercely as any mother can, though the world has never allowed us to be proud of who we are. Your father fell not from wickedness, but from pride. He would not beg, not even when the creditors came. I scrubbed floors and washed linen so you might have bread. You were never a servant to me. You were the daughter of a dream I never dared speak aloud." Tears welled in Eliza's eyes, slipping down her cheeks in silence. The chapel was still. Outside, the last rays of sunlight bled through crimson glass and painted her skin in shades of memory. She folded the letter, pressed it to her chest, and whispered a promise to no one, to never again forget where she came from, no matter what eyes watched her, no matter what rumors bloomed in the dark. That evening, in the drawing room, Lady Anne Strathmore played a Chopin nocturne with exquisite skill. Her fingers glided over the keys with elegance, her expression the perfect portrait of cultivated sorrow. Sebastian stood at the far end of the room, watching, listening. He applauded politely when the final note faded. Lady Anne looked up, her blue eyes meeting his, her smile demure. "Would your Grace indulge me in a game of chess?" she asked sweetly. The guests murmured approval. He inclined his head and joined her. As they played, she spoke in soft tones of music, of Vienna, of art and diplomacy. Her every movement was calculated, but never obvious. Her every word was a performance wrapped in grace. She was, by all accounts, the ideal duchess. Yet even as she moved her queen with flawless strategy, Sebastian's gaze drifted. Across the room, through the shadowed arch, a figure passed. Eliza. She carried a tray of wine goblets, her eyes downcast, her step measured. She did not look toward the Duke. And still, his chest tightened with something he could not name. Lady Anne noticed. Her hand faltered ever so slightly on the chess piece. In the silence that followed, a clock chimed 8. And the season of performance continued. Each note, each smile, each glance another page in a story neither of them had meant to begin. The rain had begun before dawn. A somber, unrelenting drizzle that blurred the contours of Ashbourne Hall and turned the gravel paths into narrow streams of shifting grey. It was not the romantic rain of poetry, nor the soft weeping of skies in mourning. It was steady, determined, cold. The kind of rain that crept into the bones and did not ask permission. By mid-morning, the house had surrendered to the weather. The windows, usually open to admit the pale winter sun, remained shuttered. The hearths roared in defiance, their flames casting gold and orange over walls of carved oak. Servants moved more slowly, their footsteps muffled on damp stone. And in the east wing, where the air always felt heavier, Eliza Green stood by the linen closet, staring at a single item resting atop a folded towel, a lavender glove, delicate and unmistakably fine, forgotten by Lady Anne Strathmore after the previous evening's musicale. The glove should have been retrieved hours ago, but the household had been thrown into quiet disarray with the arrival of another guest from London, and no one had remembered it until now. Mrs. Templeton's voice had been sharp but weary. "Fetch it before it becomes sodden or lost, Eliza, her ladyship will ask." And so, with her shawl clutched close and the collar of her dress pinned high against her neck, Eliza crossed the lower hall and descended the side stairs. Outside, the rain fell in sheets. The glove, she had been told, had been left on the garden bench just beyond the conservatory, where Lady Anne had taken her tea and declared the roses pathetically provincial. Eliza hesitated under the portico, staring at the curtain of rain. Then, with a breath not quite steady, she stepped into it. The cold struck her first, sharp as needles, biting through the wool of her dress. Her boots sank into the softened earth, and her skirts, though lifted, caught the edge of a puddle that splashed up her calves. She moved carefully, her eyes fixed on the bench that loomed just beyond the hedgerow, dark and glistening under the weight of rain. The glove was still there. It lay curled like a petal torn from a bloom, its fingers pale against the wet wood. She bent quickly, her fingers trembling from the cold as she reached for it. And then her foot slid. The moss beneath her boot was slick, treacherous, hidden by fallen leaves. Her balance gave way, and before she could catch the stone balustrade beside her, she fell hard against the path. Pain exploded in her ankle, sharp and immediate, a cry rising in her throat that died before it could escape. She lay there stunned, the rain soaking her sleeves, the glove crushed beneath her hand. Footsteps, firm, deliberate, impossibly out of place on the sodden path. "Eliza!" She turned her head. Sebastian. He moved toward her without hesitation, rain streaming from his coat, his hair flattened to his forehead. His eyes, those storm-colored eyes, were filled with something that unsettled her more than the pain. Alarm. In one motion, he knelt beside her, his hands reaching without touching. "Where does it hurt?" "My ankle," she whispered, wincing. He exhaled, a sound full of restraint. Gently, and with a care that did not match his rank, he slid one arm beneath her back and the other under her knees. Her breath caught as he lifted her. His chest was warm against her, his coat damp, his scent, leather, sandalwood, and something uniquely his, wrapped around her like a memory she had never lived. He did not speak as he carried her inside, only looked straight ahead, with a furrowed brow and lips pressed tightly together. The halls echoed with his steps. Servants stopped and stared, mouths slightly parted, but no one dared question him. He did not take her to the servants' quarters. Instead, he carried her to the old infirmary wing, a quiet set of rooms that had once been used by the previous duchess during her final illness. No one had entered them since. The door creaked open, and warmth met them. The hearth had been kept lit by some old routine, though no one had expected it to be needed. He laid her gently on the chaise beside the fire. Her skirts clung to her legs, soaked and heavy. Her hair, usually pinned with such care, had loosened in the fall, and a single strand curved along her cheek. Sebastian stepped back only far enough to remove his coat and toss it across the armchair. Then he turned to her once more, kneeling as he removed her boot, with a tenderness that startled her. When she winced, his hand brushed hers. "I'm sorry." She looked at him then, really looked. Water glistened on his temples. A single drop hung from the corner of his jaw. He seemed at once more human and more unreachable than ever before. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a dry cloth from the cabinet and wrapped it gently around her ankle. "Because I brought you into a world that watches everything. Because you are not meant to be seen, and yet I keep seeing you." She did not know what to say. He stood, ran a hand through his hair, and walked to the fireplace. The flames cast golden light across his face, softening its sharpness, revealing something she had only glimpsed before, the weight he carried, not just of grief, but of guilt. "Eleanor loved the rain," he said suddenly. Eliza looked up. "She would walk in it without a cloak, just to feel it on her skin. I used to think it made her brave. Now, I wonder if it was just her way of not feeling numb." There was silence, filled only by the sound of the fire and the distant tapping of rain on glass. "I did not expect to speak of her," he said softly, as though ashamed. "You needed to," Eliza replied. He turned then, his gaze meeting hers across the space. There was no pretense in his eyes, no shield, only a man unburdening himself before someone who could not offer judgment, only presence. "Eliza," he said quietly, "what do you see when you look at me?" She did not hesitate. Someone still listening for footsteps that no longer come. He closed his eyes. Mrs. Templeton entered then, quietly, her hands full of towels and hot tea. She paused at the sight of the Duke, standing close to the chaise, his face unreadable. Her eyes moved to Eliza, pale, soaked, yet somehow luminous beside the fire. Then back to the Duke, whose expression had shifted into something not cold, not formal, but unguarded. She said nothing. She merely nodded, placed the tray on the table, and slipped back into the corridor. That night, as Eliza lay on the narrow cot in the infirmary, wrapped in blankets and listening to the fire crackle, her eyes fluttered closed, and in her dreams, hands reached for hers, but never touched. Fingers brushed the air beside her cheek. A voice, low and reverent, whispered her name but never said it aloud. She dreamed of warmth unspoken, of silence heavy with meaning. She dreamed of the rain. Ashbourne Hall had known whispers before. It had survived generations of quiet scandals tucked beneath silken tapestries, heartbreaks masked by family portraits, and feuds polished into etiquette. But the whisper that now stirred its corridors was different. It was not noble. It did not travel through letters written in French or hide behind lace fans. It was sharper, colder, and it had a name, Eliza Green. She did not hear it directly. No one ever spoke her name with malice to her face. It hovered instead in the pauses between conversations, in the flutter of fans during tea, in the too quiet silence that fell when she entered a room. She felt it in the stiffness of shoulders that used to turn with ease, in the sudden hush of two maids when she passed through the laundry. It slithered into the servants' hall and made its nest behind the salt barrels and drying linens, where judgment grew like mildew in the damp. It began with a single glance, Lady Anne Strathmore, wrapped in a gown the colour of crushed lavender, had looked up from her embroidery and found Eliza across the room, placing fresh coals in the drawing-room grate. There had been nothing in Eliza's gaze, no challenge, no presumption, only presence, yet that had been enough. The expression that passed over Lady Anne's porcelain face was brief, almost imperceptible. A twitch of the jaw, a tightening of her grip on the embroidery hoop. The next day, the glove incident was revived. Eliza, wasn't it, who retrieved my glove from the garden during the storm? Lady Anne asked at breakfast, her voice a melody of innocence laced with frost. Yes, my lady, Mrs. Templeton replied evenly. Such loyalty, Lady Anne mused, letting her spoon rest in her untouched porridge. Or is it a preference? The room grew still for the span of a heartbeat. No one dared interpret the comment aloud, but the seed had been planted. That same afternoon, Lady Anne requested a private audience with Mrs. Templeton in the blue sitting room. The door remained closed for nearly 30 minutes. No raised voices, no tears, only the low, composed tone of a woman accustomed to navigating power through measured words. When the door opened, Mrs. Templeton emerged with her chin high and her lips pressed into a line neither firm nor soft. Her eyes betrayed nothing. But later, when she passed Eliza in the corridor, her gaze lingered longer than usual. Eliza noticed. That evening, Charles Hawthorne stood by the fireplace in the study, a leather-bound ledger open but forgotten in his hands. "She's becoming a topic," he said quietly. Sebastian, seated in the armchair, did not look up from the decanter he was holding. He poured a small amount of brandy into the glass, but did not drink. "Who?" he asked, though he already knew. "Miss Green." Sebastian's jaw tightened. "You cannot protect her from the inevitable," Charles continued gently. "There are expectations surrounding your position. You may not have chosen them, but they were chosen for you the moment you drew your first breath as an Ashbourne." Sebastian stood and walked to the window. Outside, the garden lay soaked and glistening, the roses still in mourning from the storm. "I never intended harm," he said. "I do not believe you did," Charles replied. "But intention does not shield anyone from consequence." Downstairs, Eliza finished folding the last of the linens. Her ankle still ached faintly, but she ignored it. The house felt different, not colder exactly, but narrower, as though the walls had inched closer. She returned to her quarters, modest, tucked behind the main kitchen, and paused. The door was ajar. She had not left it so. Her steps were slow, cautious. The room appeared unchanged at first glance, her basin untouched, the small oil lamp still trimmed, the curtain slightly askew from the breeze through the high window. But then she saw it. On the floor, beside the wooden chest where she kept her personal items, lay a torn piece of parchment. She knelt. It was a sketch, or had been. The lines were faint now, smudged from moisture or haste, but she recognized the subject instantly. The Duke. His profile shaded delicately, with the same haunted eyes she had drawn more than once. The page had been torn deliberately. The upper corner was missing. The crease across his face suggested it had been folded and thrown, perhaps even stepped on. Her throat tightened. Not for the drawing itself, it could be redone, but for what it meant. Someone had entered her space. Someone had sought to wound her where she was most hidden, most vulnerable. Not with words, with silence, with intrusion. She stood slowly and placed the fragment on her bed. That night, she found herself alone in the linen closet, retrieving a shawl for Mrs. Templeton's nightly rounds. The air was close, thick with starch and soap. As she turned, the housekeeper stepped into the doorway. "Eliza!" The name, spoken softly, startled her. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Templeton looked at her for a long moment, eyes unreadable. "I defended you," she said at last, "to a woman who wears civility like a blade." Eliza did not answer. She felt her pulse quicken. "She asked questions," Mrs. Templeton continued, "questions she already believed she knew the answers to. That is the danger of women like her. They do not seek truth, only confirmation. Eliza nodded, her hands folded tightly before her. "There is a difference," the housekeeper said, her voice low, "between being watched and being hunted." A pause. Then, with rare gentleness, Mrs. Templeton reached out and touched Eliza's arm. "Be careful, child. Not everyone is kind." And with that, she turned and vanished into the corridor, leaving Eliza standing in the linen-scented dark, the warning echoing louder than any accusation. The night of the masquerade arrived wrapped in wind and moonlight. Ashbourne Hall, usually so composed in its elegance, now shimmered with a kind of opulence that belonged more to legend than to reality. Each window glowed with candlelight, each hallway hummed with anticipation. Lanterns swayed gently at the gates, their flames protected by etched glass. Carriages lined the drive, glittering with polished brass and crests passed down through generations. Inside, the house was transformed. Silk draperies in tones of plum and silver cascaded down the staircases. Garlands of evergreen and violet tied with velvet ribbon adorned the arches. The ballroom had been swept and waxed until its floor gleamed like a dark mirror, and above it the crystal chandeliers sparkled with such fervor it seemed they might rain stars. Every corner of the house exhaled beauty, every breath of it artifice. The guests arrived masked and adorned like gods from a forgotten age. They moved in rustling silk and embroidered brocade, faces half hidden behind filigree and feathers. Their laughter was sweet, polished, tinged with the thrill of pretense. But in the back corridors of the hall, the world moved differently. Eliza Green had not been invited to the ball. Of course not. Her name had not been written in any gilded calligraphy, and her presence would not have complemented the crystal chandeliers. She was to remain, as always, behind the scenes, folding linens, warming rooms, lighting fires, fetching parcels forgotten by guests too important to remember them. It was one such errand that sent her hurrying through the servants' wing just after the 9th bell had rung. "Take this to the sewing room," Mrs. Templeton had instructed, handing her a bundle wrapped in muslin. "Lady Marley lost a ribbon and refuses to leave her suite without it." "Yes, ma'am," Eliza had replied, her voice quiet. But in the haste of her task and the confusion of the shifting footmen and unfamiliar guests straying into the side halls, Eliza took the wrong stair. She turned one corner too early, missed the narrow passage that led to the seamstress's quarters, and pushed open a set of doors that should have remained closed to her world. The candlelight hit her first. She blinked. Then the music. Strings, rising and falling like a tide made of silk and breath. She froze. Before her stretched the ballroom, not the one she knew by day, empty and echoing. This ballroom was alive, glowing, full, crowned by laughter and grace, and something far more dangerous, vision. And in that moment, they saw her. Not the crowd, not the dancers. Him, Sebastian. He stood near the orchestra, masked in a half-face of deep green and gold, his gaze skimming the crowd until it caught her. She might have disappeared again if not for the dress. The laundry girl had offered it to her earlier in the day, a simple lavender frock with a loose seam and a neckline too wide for fashion. "Try it on," she had whispered, giggling, "just for a breath, just to remember you're made of more than starch and salt." Eliza had relented, only for a moment, pulling it over her shift and marveling at how the color seemed to make her skin look warmer, her eyes brighter. She had forgotten to remove it before her errand. And now she stood there, in borrowed fabric, in borrowed light, beneath a ceiling painted with cherubs and stars, and she could not breathe. Sebastian took a single step forward. The world around him blurred. Music continued. Dancers spun. But his eyes did not leave hers. Eliza turned. She fled through the nearest corridor, the folds of lavender catching at her ankles, her breath tight in her chest. She did not stop until she reached the dim passage behind the staircase, where the flicker of a single wall sconce offered solace. She leaned against the cold stone, eyes closed. A footstep echoed behind her. She did not need to turn. "I frightened you," came his voice, low and steady. She shook her head. "You were not meant to see me," she said. "I see you every day," he replied. Her eyes opened. He stood just beyond reach, no longer masked, no longer guarded. The space between them was no more than a breath, but it held an ocean of constraint. "You should go back," she murmured. "They'll be waiting for you." He did not move. "Let them wait." Her hands trembled, fingers brushing the fabric at her sides. "This isn't real," she whispered. "No," he agreed, "it isn't." And yet neither of them stepped away. His hand lifted, slowly, cautiously, as though fearing the spell might break. He reached toward her, not to take, not to possess, but to offer. His fingers hovered beside hers, close enough to feel the heat, to sense the possibility of contact. But he did not close the space. Their eyes met. In his, she saw hunger, quiet, restrained, devastating. In hers, he saw sorrow, dignity, and something else. Longing. A longing born not of fantasy, but of recognition. It lasted only a moment. A voice called from the corridor beyond. Lady Anne, asking for the Duke in tones too sweet to be sincere. Sebastian's jaw tightened. Eliza stepped back, her arms drawing around herself. "You must go," she said softly. He nodded once, but before he turned, he said her name, not as a command, not even as a question, as a memory. Eliza. And then he was gone. She stood alone in the hush, left behind, the lavender dress clinging to her skin like a secret. And though she would change back into her uniform before the next bell rang, though she would fold that dress and return it to the laundry bin, though she would carry the parcel to the sewing room and say nothing of what had passed, the moment would live forever between them. Not as scandal, not as sin, but as truth. The air in Ashbourne Hall no longer moved freely. It clung to the tapestries and heavy drapes like a secret, whispering through the corridors, curling beneath doorways, and pressing its weight upon every breath drawn behind closed doors. The masquerade had passed, but it left behind a silence far more dangerous than any scandal shouted from the rooftops. For in that silence expectation grew, and expectation, when left to fester in noble halls, turned swiftly to ultimatum. Lady Anne Strathmore stood before the mirror in her guest chamber, her reflection glowing softly in the filtered light of a winter morning. Her gown, a pale blush silk edged in ivory lace, fit her form with architectural precision. Her golden curls were pinned high, threaded with mother-of-pearl combs imported from Venice. She looked every inch the future Duchess of Ashbourne, and yet her eyes were steel. Behind her, her lady's maid tightened the final ribbon of her corset. "He's waited long enough," Lady Anne murmured, not to the girl behind her but to her own reflection, "and so have I." That afternoon she requested a private audience with the Duke. The drawing room chosen for their conversation had once belonged to his mother. Its walls were lined with faded portraits and the faint scent of lavender. Outside the tall windows, the garden lay dormant under a layer of frost. Inside, time stood still. Sebastian stood by the hearth, his cravat loosened just enough to suggest restlessness. He had expected this moment for days. He had not, however, expected the quiet fury that shone in Lady Anne's eyes when she entered and closed the door behind her. "Your Grace," she began, her voice smooth and honeyed, "I've enjoyed my time here immensely." He inclined his head, his hands folded behind his back. "You are most gracious. And yet," she continued, stepping closer, her tone still gentle, "I grow weary of uncertainty." Sebastian said nothing. Lady Anne's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "We are no longer children playing courtship games, Sebastian. The season is nearing its end. Invitations are declining, whispers are growing. You must name your future duchess, or risk giving the ton something far more dangerous than gossip, ambiguity." He remained silent. "I'm not here to beg for affection," she added, her voice lower now, edged in coldness. "But I am here to claim what is mine by right of blood, beauty, and societal expectation. We both know that this match is the most advantageous. I offer you refinement, respectability, heirs. I ask for one thing in return, certainty. Sebastian turned slowly. There are many things I admire in you, Lady Anne, he said, his voice measured. But love is not among them. Her chin lifted. Love is for novels and fools. You had it once, and look where it left you. Grief is not loyalty, Your Grace, it is indulgence, and the world will not wait for you to awaken. His jaw clenched. Lady Anne stepped even closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. You hesitate, not because of mourning, but because of her. Sebastian stiffened. That maid, she said, the word curling like smoke. That quiet little mouse who watches from shadows and sketches you like a schoolgirl. Do you believe the world will welcome her? Shall we parade her through London in borrowed lace and introduce her as the next Duchess of Ashbourne? His breath caught, but he did not respond. Lady Anne's eyes gleamed. I know who she is. I know her bloodline. A clergyman father who died in debtor's prison. A laundress mother who scrubbed floors in the alleys of Leeds. She has no name, no dowry, no lineage. Her hands are calloused, her past shameful. She leaned in, her final words a dagger sheathed in civility. If you do not make your intentions clear by week's end, I shall make hers known. Then she turned and swept from the room, the rustle of her skirts, a final declaration of war. What she did not know, what no one had seen, was the figure standing just beyond the corridor, hidden in a sliver of shadow near the old parlour doors. Mrs. Templeton. Her eyes had narrowed, her lips had tightened, but she remained still, listening, her hands folded before her like a monument carved in stone. That evening, as the last of the guests retired and the household settled into its rhythm of night, Mrs. Templeton found Eliza in the laundry room, folding freshly dried linen with quiet concentration. Eliza, she said gently. The girl turned, startled. The lantern's glow touched her cheek, revealing eyes already rimmed in fatigue. The housekeeper stepped forward and placed a hand on her arm. There are things in this world, she said slowly, that do not belong to fairness. Eliza looked at her, confused. Someone has been speaking against you, Mrs. Templeton continued. Someone with enough polish to make cruelty sound like reason. Eliza said nothing, her fingers curled tighter around the fabric in her hands. I defended you once, Mrs. Templeton said, but you must defend yourself now. You must choose silence or dignity, and they are not the same. There was a long pause. Then Eliza nodded, her throat thick. Thank you, she whispered. In the morning, Sebastian stood before the assembled guests in the grand hall. The fire crackled. The portraits of his ancestors stared down in noble silence. Lady Anne stood to his right, perfectly composed. The others, gathered in expectant murmurs, waited. Sebastian lifted his gaze, and his voice echoed with calm finality. I have made my decision. A hush fell. I shall not take a wife this season. A breath, sharp, collective. I will not marry for duty, nor shall I offer my name as a prize to be traded among families. He paused. This household will return to its natural rhythm. I thank each of you for your company. And with that, he turned and walked away. Behind him, silence fractured. Whispers exploded like cracks in porcelain. Lady Anne stood frozen, her mouth set, her hands clenched in her gloves. The guests turned to each other in confusion, in disbelief. And above it all, Eliza stood on the staircase landing, unnoticed by most, her hand resting on the banister. Her eyes met his as he passed beneath her. No words, only truth, only silence, and within it, a world changing. The dawn had not yet come, and Ashbourne Hall lay in that fragile hour between night and morning when the world breathes most quietly. The wind outside was soft, brushing against the windows like a memory. The embers in the drawing-room hearth had burned low, casting only the faintest golden hue over the stone floor and carved mantelpiece. Eliza Green moved through the stillness like a soul already departed. She carried no trunk, only a modest carpet bag. well worn, its leather softened by time, and in her other hand a roll of paper bound with a ribbon the color of dried violets. She wore her plainest dress, the brown muslin with the frayed hem, and her shawl was pulled tightly around her shoulders. Her hair, always pinned, was gathered in a low knot, but a strand had escaped and rested against her cheek. She did not tuck it away. Her steps were silent, rehearsed. She knew this house too well, its creaks and corners, the way certain doors sighed open if not pushed with care, the weight of silence in rooms that once knew laughter. She reached the Duke's study. The door was unlocked. She entered. The fire had been left burning overnight, a rare indulgence. The scent of smoke and oak lingered in the air. His desk stood near the window, a monument of order and restraint. Ledgers neatly stacked, correspondence bundled, an ivory-handled letter opener resting precisely where it always did. With trembling hands, Eliza placed the rolled sketch at the center of the desk. She adjusted nothing else. She added no note, only the drawing. Then from the inner pocket of her shawl, she pulled an envelope, thick parchment, sealed not with wax, but with string. She placed it beside the sketch, its presence modest, almost apologetic. She looked around the room once more, and then she turned and walked away. She did not pause, not at the staircase, not by the chapel, not even at the east corridor where she had once glimpsed him in the garden mist. She did not turn her head when she passed the portrait of the late Duchess, nor when she stepped into the servants' hall one final time. Mrs. Templeton met her at the side entrance. The older woman wore her coat over her dressing gown and held a lantern in one hand. Her face was composed, though her eyes were not. "I cannot stop you," she said quietly. "I know. Should I try?" "No." Mrs. Templeton studied her for a long moment. Then gently she placed a gloved hand on Eliza's cheek. "You were never meant to stay in shadows," she whispered. "You have too much light." Eliza's throat tightened. The older woman stepped back, opened the door, and let the morning wind carry her child of silence away. By the time the sun broke through the clouds over Ashbourne, Eliza Green had disappeared from its halls. It was Charles Hawthorne who found the letter. He entered the study just before 10, as he did every morning, to deliver the day's correspondences. He paused when he saw the rolled parchment. He recognized Eliza's hand instantly. A flutter of dread passed through him. He had always been a man of reason, of documents and ledgers, but at that moment he felt something cold settle beneath his ribs. He opened the sketch first. It was Sebastian, seated not at a banquet, not in court, but in the old reading chair beside the fireplace, his shoulders slightly slouched, his cravat undone. One hand resting on a closed book, the other curled gently in thought. There was no crown in his posture, no title in his eyes, only a man. And in the drawing, something pulsed, a tenderness, a reverence, a deep and unspoken knowing. Charles placed it down, breath unsteady. Then he took up the letter and with measured hands carried it to the Duke. Sebastian had been in the conservatory, a room he rarely visited, seated beside the cold fountain. He did not look up until Charles's shadow fell across the threshold. "What is it?" he asked, his voice hoarse from a night without sleep. "A letter, Your Grace." He accepted it in silence. Charles hesitated, then left. Sebastian broke the string slowly. The parchment crackled like autumn leaves. The handwriting was delicate, steady, and deeply familiar. "My lord, forgive my impertinence in leaving you words where I should offer nothing at all. But if silence were still my companion, I fear I would vanish completely. There are truths I never dared speak, not because they were shameful, but because I feared they would weigh too heavily upon you. I was born to a man who once stood in a pulpit with fire in his voice and ended his days behind bars, defeated by pride and debt. My mother scrubbed stone floors in inns and washhouses across Leeds so that I might eat. I do not hide them from you because I am ashamed, but because I knew the world would be. I came to Ashbourne to work, to serve, to vanish. I expected nothing. I asked for nothing. I wanted only a quiet corner in which to forget I had once dreamed of color. And then I saw you, not as the world sees you, not as the title carved in marble. I saw a man who walks through memory as though it were a winter garden, where nothing grows and everything echoes. I saw your grief not as weakness but as devotion. I saw your solitude, and I did not fear it. You once asked what I saw when I looked at you. I never told you. I was afraid, but now I will. I saw the man I would have chosen had I been allowed to choose. I leave not because I regret what has passed, but because I cherish it too dearly to see it destroyed. The world will never forgive a heart that rises from the ashes of silence, but I will. I will remember you, not as a duke, but as the man in the firelight who said my name like a prayer. Be well, my lord, and do not forget the color you once made me remember. Eliza Sebastian's hands trembled. The words blurred, smudged not by ink, but by tears he had not intended to fall. He sat, slowly, heavily on the edge of the sofa, the letter in his lap, his fingers pressing it to his chest, as though to stop something inside from breaking open. The room was silent. And in that silence, he knew what he had done. He had let go of something that had never begged to be held, something that had asked only to be seen. And now, it was gone. The sea at Lyme was a different kind of companion than the wind-swept stillness of Ashbourne. It did not whisper, it roared. It did not ask permission to enter one's thoughts. It crashed into them with the force of eternity. The waves, silver by morning and steel by dusk, beat against the worn cliffs like a question that never needed answering. Eliza Green had chosen this town for its quiet and for its salt. The quiet, because it gave her space to remember without weeping. The salt, because it reminded her that grief could sting and still preserve. She arrived with nothing more than a letter of reference from Mrs. Templeton and a parcel of clothes worn soft by work. The schoolmistress at the parish academy, a brisk, red-cheeked widow named Mrs. Talbot, had taken one look at her and said, "You've seen hard days. You'll understand, children." And so she was given a room beneath the eaves of the schoolhouse and a new rhythm of life. Mornings began with chalk dust and firewood, the scent of ink and the sound of little boots clattering across stone floors. Her pupils ranged from 6 to 11, their hands perpetually stained with charcoal or jam, their laughter unguarded, their questions endless. They asked nothing of her past and offered no gossip about dukes or titles. To them, she was simply Miss Green, the one who taught them to read by candlelight, who recited poetry as though it mattered, who smiled only rarely but always kindly. It was enough. And yet, as the days lengthened and the salt burned her cheeks, Eliza carried the silence of Ashbourne like a folded note inside her chest. The sound of his voice, low and steady, echoed sometimes when she rinsed the ink from her fingers. The weight of his gaze lingered in the corners of her reflection. At night, when the sea wind rattled the panes, she would hold the quilt tighter and whisper into her pillow, "You were never mine to keep." Weeks passed. February came with wind and fog and the scent of snow that never fell. One evening, as twilight descended and the oil lamps flickered weakly against the damp, Eliza remained with a small group of students who had stayed late for recitation. The schoolroom was cold despite the fire, the stone walls swallowing heat like thirst. Her shawl hung around her shoulders, and she stood beside the blackboard, correcting young Thomas Merton's attempt at verse. "The sky is like a velvet cup," she read softly. "That's lovely, Thomas, but perhaps don't rhyme cup with pup unless the dog has a reason to be in the sky." The children giggled, their breath visible in the air. Then, hoofbeats. Outside, on the narrow lane, heavy, urgent, out of place. The children turned as one, the wooden shutters rattling as the wind rose. A carriage, unmarked. Its wheels groaned as it came to a halt just beyond the gate. Eliza's hand stilled on the chalk. The door opened, bootsteps, and then he filled the doorway. Sebastian, soaked in rain. his coat open, his gloves forgotten, his cravat loosened, hair slicked to his brow, eyes darker than the sea that raged beyond the cliffs. He said nothing, neither did she, not at first. The children were silent, as though something ancient had entered the room. Even little Clara, who never stopped whispering, held her breath. He took a step forward, the floor creaking beneath him. And another. And then he knelt before her. The children gasped. Eliza's heart stopped. "I've come not as a duke," he said, voice barely above a breath, "but as the man you saw when no one else did." The fire crackled. Rain tapped at the windows. Eliza's lips parted, but no sound emerged. Her hands trembled where they held her shawl. Her eyes filled slowly, not from pain, not even from shock, but from recognition, from the unbearable truth of him standing there, undone and whole, all at once. "I read your letter," he continued, his voice shaking now, 100 times. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I cannot go on without asking for it." Still, she said nothing, only stared, and then tears spilled down her cheeks, not weeping, not sobbing, just quiet tears, like the kind one sheds when something longed for arrives too gently to bear. "I love you," he whispered. The words landed not like thunder, but like the final note in a sonata. One of the children clapped, then another, then all of them. Tiny palms smacked together, thrilled by the romance unfolding before them, like a scene from a fairy tale they'd never thought real. Eliza did not smile. Not yet. She knelt slowly, meeting him on the same worn floorboards, and reached out, not to touch his face, but to place her hand over his heart. It beat wildly beneath his linen shirt. She did not speak. She didn't need to, because in her silence there was an answer that only he could hear. And in that classroom, lit by one trembling lamp and the breath of rain on old glass, something long denied was finally allowed to exist. Not scandal, not duty, not fear, but love. Simple, certain, and true. The first sign that the rhythm of Ashbourne Hall had changed was not in the bells, nor in the household schedule, but in the air itself. The silence that once clung to the corridors had softened. The rooms, long accustomed to holding their breath, seemed now to exhale gently. It was not the silence of mourning or of decorum. It was peace, gone were the long, expectant glances of the footmen, the polished smiles of visiting baronesses, the orchestrated performances of ladies with perfect posture and paper-thin intentions. In their place, quiet understanding settled in the joints of the house like sun-warmed stone. The Duke had returned, and with him came something no one in the household had expected to witness again: stillness without sorrow. Eliza walked the corridors now, not as a shadow, but as herself. She no longer hurried, no longer cast her eyes downward at every turn. Her presence was no longer a question, but an answer. She still wore her simple dresses, still tied her hair with modest ribbons, but she moved like someone who had been seen and had chosen in return. She and Sebastian were to be married quietly. There were no notices in the society pages, no orchestras commissioned, no invitations sent to Mayfair drawing rooms. There was no silk imported from France, no white horses, no tiaras inherited from ancient grandmothers. Only a chapel on the far side of the estate, weathered stone and ivy-covered, where the late Duchess had once prayed alone. It was a grey morning when they stood before the altar. Eliza wore pale lavender, subtle, unadorned. Her dress modest but graceful, the hem gently brushing the slate floor. Her hands were bare of jewels. Around her neck hung a simple silver chain. Her cheeks were flushed, not with rouge, but with a quiet, steady joy that had been earned, not given. Sebastian stood beside her, not in ceremonial regalia, but in his favorite charcoal frock coat and a soft cravat that Eliza herself had mended. He looked at her as though the chapel had vanished, and only she remained. The ceremony was brief. Mrs. Templeton stood to Eliza's left, her eyes glistening despite her attempts to look stern. Charles Hawthorne stood as witness, his hands folded neatly, a softness in his gaze rarely seen beyond numbers and ledgers. Two young gardeners, Jacob and Thomas, brothers who had grown up under the estate's care, served as witnesses, wide-eyed and reverent. No one wept aloud. There was no need. After the vows were spoken and the rings placed, not of gold, but of silver engraved with ivy leaves, they did not kiss at once. They simply held each other's gaze, a silence between them that said more than 1,000 declarations. Then, without fanfare, they walked out into the breeze. Spring had begun to press its fingertips into the earth. The garden paths were no longer frozen. The roses had not yet bloomed, but they waited, patient and knowing. Lady Anne, upon hearing of the marriage through a visiting cousin, had promptly dictated a series of letters, cleverly worded, laced with innuendo, meant to spark flames where only embers remained. She made no open accusations. That would be unseemly. But she sent veiled questions to London, to Bath, to every corner of the season's watchful world. Charles intercepted them all. He did not burn them. He filed them in a drawer beneath the estate ledgers, beneath deeds and documents long forgotten. He did not tell Sebastian. He did not need to. Some matters, he believed, should die quietly. One letter, however, did reach its destination, Parliament, and from them came a single pointed response, an invitation withdrawn, an engagement of significance, a gathering of lords. Sebastian received the message while seated in the library, Eliza nearby with her sketchpad in her lap. He read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it beside the book he had not yet opened. Eliza looked up from her sketch. Bad news? He leaned back in his chair, his fingers brushing his temple. An invitation has been rescinded. She paused. Do you regret it? He looked at her then, not as a duke, not as a man denied a seat at a powerful table, but simply as the man who had crossed the sea wind to kneel at her feet. I'd rather be exiled in truth, he said softly, than crowned in lies. She returned to her drawing without speaking, but the corners of her mouth lifted slightly. That afternoon, they walked to the garden. The air was cool but gentle. A breeze stirred the ivy, and the linden tree near the rosewalk stood tall and still. It had been there long before either of them had been born, its bark weathered, its branches reaching towards sky and memory alike. They sat beneath it on the worn stone bench, carved with initials faded by time. Eliza sketched, as she often did now, not portraits of sorrow or longing, but moments. His hand holding hers, the curve of a garden path, the reflection of the chapel in a rain puddle. Her hands moved with grace, but her gaze lingered often on him. Sebastian watched her in silence. Her brow furrowed slightly in concentration. A curl had escaped from her chignon and danced against her cheek. The sunlight filtered through the linden leaves, scattering golden dapples across her dress, her hair, the tips of her fingers. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his voice low. You were never the maid. She stopped drawing. You were always, he said, the heart of this house. She turned her head slowly. The expression in her eyes was neither shy nor surprised. It was certain. It was the look of a woman who had once been asked for nothing and now was offered everything. And for the first time in many years, Ashbourne Hall held not the ghost of a love once lost, but the breath of one found. The roses had returned. They bloomed now in wild, unapologetic color, climbing the trellises, spilling over stone borders, nodding beneath the windows of the east wing where the nursery curtains fluttered in the morning breeze. The garden no longer whispered of sorrow, it sang. Ashbourne Hall had changed. Not in its bones, the old stones still bore the quiet dignity of centuries, but in its breath, in its warmth, in the way the staff no longer whispered at the edges of rooms, but moved with quiet joy, like people who had once lived under watchful silence and now lived under light. Inside the drawing room, laughter echoed. Small feet pattered across the floorboards, and a boy with ash-brown curls came rushing in, a red ribbon clutched in one hand. Behind him, a girl no older than 5 chased him with fierce determination, her braids flying, her cheeks flushed. "Elijah," she cried, "you promised I could have it next." He laughed, so like his father's laugh, deep and surprising, and darted behind the settee. "Only if you can catch me." A woman entered then, her hands still powdered with graphite, a smudge on her sleeve where a drawing had been hurriedly laid aside. Her presence quieted the chaos without a word. The children paused, then looked toward her with bright eyes. "Time to wash for supper," Eliza said gently. They groaned in unison, but obeyed. As they disappeared up the staircase, Eliza remained in the doorway a moment longer, her fingers tracing the hem of her apron, a habit long unbroken, though she had not worn one in years. Her gaze moved toward the garden beyond the windows, where the linden tree stood as it always had. Only now there were swings tied to its branches. And on one of those swings sat a third child, smaller, quieter, a girl with pale gold hair, drawing in her lap with great seriousness. Sebastian stood nearby, leaning on the walking cane he used only when no one was watching. His eyes, still storm-grey, crinkled at the corners as he watched the child, his hand resting gently on her head. He looked up and saw Eliza through the window. The softness in his gaze was no less than it had been 8 years before. Perhaps it was even deeper now, shaped by time, by forgiveness, by the quiet rhythm of days spent side by side, not in opulence, but in ordinary grace. They had married without the blessing of the crown. The invitations to London's courts never came again. And when Sebastian resigned his ceremonial seat in Parliament the following year, the papers called it folly, but he had called it peace. Lady Anne Strathmore had not fared so gently. Her attempt to reclaim her place in society had failed, not because her lineage lacked weight, but because her bitterness had made her unwelcome even among those who had once envied her. She married eventually, an aging baronet with a taste for Italian opera and a distaste for companionship. They spent winters apart. Eliza had never once spoken ill of her. She no longer needed to. Mrs. Templeton remained at Ashbourne until her joints could no longer climb the staircases. She left the hall the same way she had ruled it, with order, dignity, and a farewell kiss to each of the children's brows. She now lived in a small cottage at the edge of the estate, where a bell tied to the front gate still chimed whenever Eliza came with tea and sketches from the girls. Charles Hawthorne, now retired from the daily burdens of stewardship, spent his days in the library, cataloguing not just ledgers, but histories, of the house, of the family, of the way love had once stepped through the fire and chosen not to flee. And as for Eliza and Sebastian, their love had not faded, it had changed. Where once it had burned like longing, it now warmed like embers. In the quiet of late evenings, they sat together by the fire, she with her sketchbook, he with a novel or a sleeping child in his lap. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they did not, but the silence between them had never again been empty. On the anniversary of her arrival at Ashbourne, Eliza returned to the old linen closet. It smelled the same, of starch and soap and time. She ran her fingers along the wooden shelf where she had once stood, young and hidden, her heart knotted with dreams she had not dared name. Now she was no longer hidden. Now she was no longer dreaming. Outside, beneath the linden tree, her children called to her, and Sebastian, ever watchful, raised a hand. She smiled. And for one long moment, with the sun dipping low and the garden steeped in gold, Eliza Green Ashbourne stood still, wife, mother, artist, duchess in all but name, and closed her eyes. The house had changed. The world had changed. But what they had found in each other, quiet, defiant, enduring, that had never changed. That had only grown. Some stories don't end with fanfare. They don't need thunder or triumph to leave a mark. They end with a quiet breath, a hand held, a gaze that says, "I choose you," still. The Quiet Heart is a story about more than romance. It is about dignity in silence, about love that grows in the shadows, about courage wrapped not in rebellion, but in restraint. It reminds us that even in a world obsessed with status and perfection, it is tenderness that endures. It is truth that sets us free. Perhaps, like Eliza, you've once felt invisible. Perhaps, like Sebastian, you've carried grief too long. But let this story be your reminder. It is never too late to be seen. It is never too late to begin again, not as who the world expects you to be, but as who you truly are. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to know what part stayed with you most. Leave your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one with care, and if you made it all the way to the end, type Linden in the comments. It's our secret word to show you were there until the final moment, beneath the tree where everything began again. If you feel moved to support the team behind these stories, you can send us a super thanks right here on YouTube. Any amount, big or small, helps us keep bringing these emotional, period-rich narratives to life. But if you're unable to give in that way, please share this video with your sister, your friend, your mother, your daughter. Pass the story on, because maybe they too need to remember that the quietest hearts often hold the fiercest love. And if you want more stories like this one, don't forget to check the other period romances I've left for you in the cards. There's a whole world waiting for you. Thank you for being part of this journey. Until the next story, with all my heart.